Welcome to the American Intelligence Media. I'm your host, Douglas Gabriel, and I'm here with the researcher of researchers, Mr. Michael McKibben. How are you today, Michael?
I'm great.
I can't wait to hear what you have to say because I had to bone up and research and get ready to let people know that the propaganda state that we live in during the Obama times, which no longer exists because Trump changed the laws, but during the Obama time, we were in the propaganda state that was unequaled, except perhaps in the time of Kaiser Wilhelm's Imperial Germany, or during the beginnings of the Tavistock Institute and the beginning of the British War Propaganda Ministry. And what you have found is absolutely insightful because it shows that from the beginning, as soon as they get technology, the first thing they do is weaponize it. And who do they weaponize it against? Not just our enemies, but also neutral countries and against the domestic people of the state itself. And this was started historically a long, long time ago. And we have told you the story of the Global Engagement Center and the Broadcasting Board of Governors and the way that $750 million a year spent on that, and the way that this Strategic Communication Laboratory Group was paid $86 million during the Trump election by Obama to create the very Russian propaganda that they say Russians created through a catering company called Concord Catering. Absolute nonsense, but that is the ham sandwich that Robert Mueller is trying to indict. A catering company that he associates with Putin, when in fact it was our own militarized, literally Department of Defense, Broadcasting Board of Governors, the Global Engagement Center, which produced the very propaganda that they're trying to blame on Russians. And we have proof of that. We've already demonstrated that to you through our investigations and through what we've revealed through that agency, and particularly the last person who ran the agency, who came out and said that he had absolute ability to go across every platform on the internet with one query to identify groups of people. Any types of demographics or logistics you want does not matter. They plug in the factors, they get the people, they target them, and they attack them. And that's what they did during the campaign. And they come out and they say this in public. We quote them in our previous investigative reports. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about this goes back to the people who are really good at it, which would, of course, be the Vatican. But secondly, the Germans, and thirdly, the Brits. And what we have found out through your investigation is that they don't care whether you're the enemy or whether or not you live in the country that you're supposed to be defending. In America, we are all considered terrorists until proven otherwise, according to the U.S. Patriot Act. That's the way it was written. And when Obama changed the National Defense Authorization Act in 2012 to add a few paragraphs that allowed the domestic people, allowed within our domestic borders, the current administration, he puts in, the current presidential administration is allowed to propagandize the people of America with lies, and we, the taxpayers, pay for it. Now, we do that to our enemies. Everyone's heard of the companies, these groups that broadcast all throughout the world to our enemies the propaganda that we want. But they propagandize Americans completely legally, according to the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, as written by President Obama. But what it goes back to is the genesis of war, the big wars, World War I, World War II, all created by a small group of propagandists who turned propaganda into a wartime business that became such a good business that war became business. So, Michael, can you tell us what your researchers have found out about the genesis of this propaganda state?
Yes, as you know, we've been working backwards, starting with the abuse of our claims against Facebook for stealing our intellectual property, our invention of social networking. We've been working backwards from then. And we several weeks ago, we stopped at the 1945-46 time frame when World War II ended, and we saw the combination of propaganda with the stay-behind networks that had been created all over the planet that then became the OSS and then became the CIA and was already the MI6 in Britain. And then we decided to keep marching back from there to see where this started, and especially related to communications and specifically electronic communications and wireless communications. And we had to stop, and we have stopped for several weeks now, on World War I and the run-up to World War I. And lo and behold, what we see is that was the very time when a weaponized wireless technology that they claim to have been invented by Marconi, which was, as we now see, stolen from Nikola Tesla, was wireless technology that was weaponized, was placed on all the British steamships all over the planet, and became the modern communication networks that we use today. And in many cases, the locations where a lot of this wireless technology was initially established hasn't changed. And so World War I is, for our mind and thinking right now, the genesis of the modern propaganda state. And what we now see is that this strategy was put forward upon the world by the British War Office and the British cabinet before the war. And inside that British cabinet, we now have access to their actual secret papers, which have been made public, and we've had researchers reading through all of these papers. And what we now see is that the British War Cabinet not only organized how wireless technology would be weaponized, but how it would be married with propaganda. And their excuse, obviously, was to counter the German propaganda that was anti-British and anti-Ally. So we created, through the Brits and American cooperation, a propaganda system in the West, which was managed out of the British War Office. We can now trace the people that were organizing that mechanism straight forward from there to their children and grandchildren to today. And what we see is a continuity that came right out of that War Office. I'm looking at one particular proposal that was made by the Minister of Information, whose name is John Buchan. And the title of his proposal on December 11th of 2017, that was about a year before the end of the war, he proposed a psychological offensive to be launched at a well-selected psychological moment. And in this document, he proposes that the British government propose a League of Nations and get all the countries of the world to sign it as a psychological offensive against the enemy. And what this reminded me of is the contemporary event in our day of the Patriot Act, where they used the events of 9/11 as the excuse to push forward the Patriot Act and get Congress to agree to it. And then in that act, we gave up all of our rights. And so what we see back 100 years ago, that they were doing exactly the same kinds of psychological warfare, not only on their enemies, but also on their own people. And in this document and a related document, we see where they admit that they were engaged in psychological operations against the American forces who were living bivouacked in England during the war. The appalling aspect of what we've discovered is that we have been our whole lives, we have been the subject of a psychological operation by not only our government, but the British government. And what we have are the actual documents out of the British government where they decided that they were going to propagandize their own people. And as you've mentioned, as of 1912, our government now can legally propagandize Americans. And so I just get incensed reading this stuff, because what we're seeing is they laid down the propaganda activity to the point where we citizens have been forced to accept the fact that our government is lying to us.
You've nailed it on the head. And the most powerful thing that I'm noticing, and I hope everyone notices this as they follow along and read the minor notes and the revelations that come out of the research of Michael McKibben and all of his friends, we'll call it. And as you read this, it should incense you, because what you're looking at is the moment when the New World Order was spelled out absolutely clearly. And the Brits said they're taking over the world and there's going to be one global government. And we really want to bring America in on this, so we need to propagandize them. So we'll consider them a special group that we are going to propagandize in a special way. Not even considered neutral or an enemy, just absolutely targeted. And so from the beginning, you've shown the very beginning of when, through the League of Nations after, of course, World War I and the attempts of America didn't come in and sign the League of Nations. League of Nations was basically useless. They couldn't even arbitrate their own squabbles in Europe, and eventually it did turn into the United Nations, and Woodrow Wilson did.
Douglas, I think I might have misspoke before when I was referring to dates. Douglas, if I can give you some context for the comments you're making, I think it helps. At least it helps me anyway. On November 11th of 1918, the armistice ending the fighting in World War I was signed. Then, about a month later, on December 20th of 1918, the War Cabinet began dividing up the functions of its propaganda department and gave the bulk of it to the Foreign Office, which continued the operations, by the way. And those operations, they have a list of 9 areas that the Foreign Office was going to take over from that activity: France, Russia, America, Central Europe, Holland and Belgium, Switzerland and Italy, Spain, Portugal, and South America, the Near and Middle East, wireless and cables, and the library. Those are their top 9. So they pushed all of that propaganda effort off to the Foreign Office, and then they privatized, essentially, some really interesting key elements of their propaganda. One, their film cinematography group, their photographic and art section, and then, most interestingly, commercial intelligence bureau in Madrid, they transferred to the Federation of British Industries, FBI. Not our FBI, but the basically the trade association that was then invited into the propaganda to engage private commercial companies in their ongoing propaganda efforts. So you can see right there that the thinking was, we're going to keep this party going, and we're going to shave off different bits for different people, but basically we're going to carry on.
Well, it made money during the war, and the bankers and the brokers who made money during the war saw that any type of communication, whether it be telecommunication, wireless communication, whether it be radio or television itself, whether it be any of these secret cable communications, which you're going to point out later had a lot to do with why this basic information war started. Because remember, this started as the Ministry of War Propaganda, both in Germany and in England. And then it became the Ministry, basically, of Truth, which was the opposite of that. And then it became the Ministry of Disinformation, or basically counterintelligence. And now we call it global media. And we just call it basic persuasion or perception management, or creating neural narratives that people may or may not even want to think. We'll just project it on them. And this is the Tavistock.
Yes.
influence. This is
Let me read you Section B. The photographic and art sections, which are financially profitable concerns, have been handed over with the assent of the Treasury to the Imperial War Museum, who will continue the work. By this arrangement, the valuable war records accumulated by the ministry will go to the department to which they naturally belong. So they had various euphemisms even in these documents to how they were justifying privatizing all of their work. And that's interesting that their photo and art section made money during the war. And then I wanted to mention one more point of that timeline, in that the Versailles Treaty occurred on June 28th of 1918. So that was 6 months after they dismantled this information. They didn't really dismantle the information department. They made a new one out of the Foreign Office and various other places, and then they privatized the intelligence section, which is probably of most interest to us today. And then the Foreign Office maintained control of wireless and cables.
Yes, you hit the word that I was looking for. Intelligence. You know, the Rothschilds became rich because in different cities in Europe, they had passenger pigeons carry information ahead of everyone else. So they were able to control markets, control the banks, control currencies and currency speculation, because remember, they were into inventing currency and controlling currency. Well, that has now turned into what we have today, but we call it global media. Now, every single person is a target, and every single person can basically be attacked, whether you're domestic or foreign, whether you're an enemy or a friend. It does not matter. All Americans are surveilled, according to James Clapper, who should be behind bars when he says that. And it hasn't stopped, as James Comey has proven, and as the investigations into our own FISA courts have proven. None of it stopped. The NSA is still as open sieve, just running wild. The Five Eyes are still spying, and we still give our intelligence to the Brits and the Australians and the New Zealanders and Canada. Why? And the rest of the UK. Why? When have they ever been proven our friend? If you look closely at what was going on with the League of Nations, what they said also in those documents you presented is that there will be other meetings that will happen during the Treaty of Versailles. Those other meetings, like Sykes-Picot, that divided up the Levant so that the wars in the Middle East are still a product of the Brits and Americans who sat behind closed doors and made those secret meetings during the time that they tried to put forth the Treaty of Versailles, which America did not sign, and led to the League of Nations, which led to the United Nations, which led to the Council on Foreign Relations, and Cecil Rhodes' Round Table, and the Royal Institute for International Affairs turning into the Council on Foreign Relations, which created the American Anglo Alliance. The Anglo-American Alliance is what created basically the outcome of World War I, World War II, Korea, and basically every other war that's happened in modern times. And it's the same people with the same war, propaganda, disinformation, counterintelligence, subversion. This is espionage acted upon every American, because the U.S. Patriot Act, which turned into the U.S. Freedom Act, guarantees that you are subject to being a terrorist until otherwise proven differently. You can be taken out of this country to Gitmo and be held there without any legal defense and without any rights whatsoever if you're considered to be connected to terrorism. That was Robert Mueller. That was Brennan. That was Clapper. They're the people who set up the mechanism to make sure that everything has to go through Robert Mueller's lens of perception, or else it doesn't exist in Washington, D.C., because otherwise the number one fixer, Robert Mueller, couldn't do his job without that. Well, what's really interesting is that in Britain, they understood early on that making movies was one of the greatest propaganda machines on the face of the earth. All you had to do was put it up there on the flickering screen. And what did they call it, Michael? Topical movies? I say the British war topical movies, probably along with Paperclip, basically became what we know as Hollywood. And if you look back upon the personalities who created it, you'd have to say, Germans went to Britain, Britain went to, with the Germans, to America and to Hollywood, and now what do we see? We see what is the industry of lies, the industry of Hollywood.
Yeah, the initial company that was given the cinematography effort of the war machine was a company called Topical Film Company, and it was essentially privatized at the end of the war and continued making these films. And I think that's a key point. What we see throughout their discussion of propaganda from 1914 to 1918 is they were, I think, quite surprised at how effective their propaganda memes were. And this guy, John Buchan, is a real key figure here who clearly had the ear of the whole cabinet. And if you go back and you look at the World War I art, you see something that we would easily call memes today. And what they realized is they could put these well-placed lies in the major newspapers, and they coordinated all this, and they actually catalog and inventory all of their lying activity during the war, and where they put it and how they put it in and who they influenced, and they discussed how they would, when they would come to the States, who in America they would meet with. And Reuters, by the way, was mentioned throughout their notes. And they would discuss how they are going to change the hearts and minds of the American people and also the British people. And what they discovered is that a lot of little lies is better than one big lie. So they just continually dripped their lies through the mainstream media. And because there was no one to counter them, they were very successful. And I think that's what they learned back then. And it got out of control, like you said, during the advent of social media, and why we see all this censorship effort right now, because they're trying to rein it back in to get back to a state where they control the only narratives that are out there. And we're letting them do it. And as official government policy, this has to stop. We cannot have a government where lying is official policy, I don't think.
That's the key factor. If the government can lie to you, why do we have a government? How are they in service to us? When did anyone who's lying to you serve you, or serve you well, or in any way could you trust or have integrity with?
No, not at all.
And why would you pay
what
them?
If somebody lies to you at work, you fire them.
So your other point,
right?
Highly important, the mainstream media has become the propaganda arm of the same war cabinet ministry propaganda. And basically it's the yellow journalism that can create a war, and define a war. If in those days, on the other side of the world, the only thing you had were newspapers, or the wireless, or messages coming on ships. Many inventions happened on the sea, and so those who controlled the seas, and those who controlled trade and mercantilism on the sea, basically were as powerful as entire nations. In some cases, more powerful.
That is correct. In these documents, it is clear that the Admiralty in the UK was the primary source of intelligence all over the world. And it's interesting today that Serco has, I don't remember how many, but it's dozens, if not hundreds, of contracts with our Navy space war today. So clearly the Admiralty, the Navy, is the source of the key information that is being put out there to these people, and they're exploiting.
In a previous conversation, we talked about Marconi, which you brought up, pointing out that, of course, it was Tesla's patents that Marconi had. And so, again, why was it an Italian inventor was brought to England, and there the stolen patents of Tesla became one of the most powerful transformations of the time, what they call disruptors now. So when wireless came, then you pointed out in our previous conversation that immediately that was the archetype of those in control of technology, which is in fact in control of information, and it is an information war, and it is information warfare we're dealing with here. So what they did was they said, Marconi, we're going to take your invention. We're going to tell everybody you can have nice secure lines, but we're actually going to spy on everyone from the beginning because why? We are the British. We control the world. And that's always been, they have a very monarchical sense of hegemony. And we have to remember that. In a way, it's almost beyond a theocracy because the Queen of England is also the head of her own church. And so we can't forget that. And when we do, we forget the power of the United Kingdom. So,
I think most people, having lived over there, most people know that that's the claim, but I didn't meet many Brits that really believe that.
Of course not, because they say it's tutelary. They say she has a nod, but we now know she has the golden shares in her purse, and she carries them everywhere. She controls Lockheed Martin. She controls the aerodynamic industry, which controls most of the money for war, and she controls uranium, and she controls the resources of the world, and nobody knows how much money she has in offshore accounts. So, that's just her. The rest of the monarchy...
Right, we must mention Rio Tinto. She's got the golden share in Rio Tinto, one of the largest mining operations in the planet.
That's what I mean. She has the resources. She has the golden share of the golden share. And she also has the uranium in America, and she has the rights on using our uranium enrichment facility in New Mexico, in Eunice, New Mexico. We've pointed that out. She's the only one who actually went toe-to-toe with Putin to fight with Hillary over who gets the money for uranium in America. So we can't ever downplay the power of the Queen. Of course, she used her Dutch and German friends in that particular deal, but there's a lot going on that if you don't see the Queen's connection and you don't understand that it doesn't matter what the standard people in England or the United Kingdom believe. We're talking about the rat lines of power and money that have been going on longer than we can even remember. And they go right back to the Vatican, and that's where they learn their tricks. And now when we see the fight going on between Imperial Germany, well, they were Ariosophists. They too wanted hegemony. They wanted the Aryans to rule, and that's where they came up with these crazy ideas from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, where they started experimenting on lesser beings and thinking that the Aryans really did need to take over the world. That was the Second Reich, the First Reich being the Roman kingdom. And they thought the Roman kingdom was just dandy. Well, look at the Roman kingdom and the absolute degradation of humanity through the Roman kingdom at the end. Well, the Second Reich followed in step, and the Third Reich of Hitler, which was created by the bad Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations and the reparations that were controlled by Charles Dawes and the Bank for International Settlement, those decisions were horrible for the world, and they basically showed that the British wished to annihilate the Germans. And they had good reason to, because they believed that they were the only ones standing in their way from basically the control of Europe.
You know what? In the long view, I'm beginning to wonder about all of those assumptions we've made. Did they really, or was that just another false flag excuse to create more war? And that is really the objective, it seems to me, is create a reason for war that you can push on the public, get them to accept it, get them to pay for it, and then allow your insiders to profit. That seems to be the MO for the last 100 years.
That's right.
So who were we really against? Was it really the Germans? I'm beginning to think no. And in the end, were the British that bothered by the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute? Because we now know from these documents at the War Office that they implemented the Kaiser Wilhelm brainwashing manual in the War Office, and then the subsequent the Wellington House, the War Office, and then initially the Tavistock Clinic that became the Tavistock Institute in 1946. So what we see is a continuity of thinking. The names changed, but the tactics did not.
Well, that's it exactly. These are intelligence agencies fighting against each other. Now, we know that so many of the most powerful people on the British Privy Council are connected to intelligence, like Sir Paddy was connected to Strategic Communications Laboratories. Lord Malloch is connected to all these election machines and rigging throughout the world, and Optech and all of the other evil machinations he's into. But many of these other members of the Privy Council have been doing this from time immemorial, working with their bankers, their brokers, but their intelligence agencies, whether it be Pigeons for the Rothschilds, or whether it be Marconi's Wireless, which then they bugged and basically considered everybody their enemy. And so a very small group of people, intelligence groups of people, private intelligence, as you pointed out later, and these intelligence groups then had their jobs, and they worked through the Franklin Institute ideas and the Franklin School ideas, whether it be the fact that 1984 and Brave New World, those are predictions of the way the globalists, and the New World Order, as you pointed out from its inception right there at the League of Nations, at that moment, that's the way they envisioned it. They didn't realize that the TV didn't need to watch the people, that the people will willingly give up their entire time, their eyeballs, their ears, their whole life to watch the tube and do whatever the tube tells them instead of the tube watching them. So it's the reverse. We've turned into a completely complicit, willing society to become what was predicted by the globalists for Brave New World, 1984, and all of the other dystopia stories that were told by the people literally paid to create what I call chaos Marxism.
Can I give you another example? In this report on the liquidation of the Ministry of Information, the John Buchan in his last section gives thanks to certain people who stayed on to help his effort in disassembling the war version of the Ministry of Information. And one of the people he calls out is Mr. Eric Hambro, who had charge of Scandinavia, Spain, and South America. And I don't know if that name rings a bell with you, but we looked him up, and he eventually became the chairman of Hambro's Bank, which anybody in the finance business will know is a very large bank. So we can see that the influence of the banking interests was quite large, and we're still looking at documents. But we also know that very early in the Tavistock history, the Rockefellers also placed their people in important positions within the Tavistock system, and were there all through the all through World War II and through the transition. So we've got the Rockefellers. We know the Rothschilds put money into the privatized version of Tavistock. We know that the British royal family put money in. And so what we see is, oh, by the way, I need to mention about Hambro, that this document was dated December 20th of 1918. In February, he was made a knight for his service during the war. So whatever service he provided to the Ministry of Information was important enough as a financier to make him a knight. Obviously, the king at the time was taking his people into the Privy Council who were going to provide the ongoing financing that they were going to use. They were going to drive markets up and down with what they learned to be fairly simple mechanisms for triggering societies to act in a certain way, to invest in a certain way, and they would just be ahead of that, riding the markets up and down, and they would be making all of the money all of the time. And if the rest of us made money, well, that was by accident.
Well, that's the exact program they used. And in America, Colonel House, who was the person who pulled the puppet strings for Woodrow Wilson, who was basically a professorial idiot, who pulled together a group called the Inquiry, and that Inquiry morphed eventually into the Council on Foreign Relations. But in 1911, long before the Treaty of Versailles, Colonel House, controlling Wilson and the White House, basically pulled together the richest Rockefeller lawyers, the richest Rothschild lawyers, the richest Morgan lawyers, and some of the most corrupt politicians in America, and they created a group called the Inquiry. And basically he gave over his entire presidency to that group. And that group was the group that was meeting in the behind closed doors with the British ministers during the Treaty of Versailles, creating these secret agreements that I made reference to. There are many of them made at that time. And the League of Nations, the Inquiry didn't want to enter into the League of Nations because they really didn't want to give power to certain nations that were going to be key in the League of Nations and the way that it was structured. So they didn't go for that, and they didn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles. They did not ratify the League of Nations, and the Inquiry basically became the group that controlled America, and by Rockefeller and Vatican invitation created the Council on Foreign Relations, which controlled our foreign policy, and that means everything foreign and basically domestic, and certainly our currency and economy, through the Council on Foreign Relations, which was an invite-only group which told the White House what to do, and basically the State Department and everyone else. So the Inquiry is this group, starting in 1911 at the same time as almost a counterpoint to Kaiser Wilhelm's Institute and to Britain's reaction to that. And I think you've pointed out that Lord Northcliffe and the Crewe House was perhaps already in place even long before Wellington House, and so on and so forth. So these things go back to the moment that technology creates the ability for advantage over one nation over another. The moment that happens, then this type of propaganda system is set up, and the very same bankers and brokers and elites at the top, very few group of people, by the way, get in and get their intelligence agencies in control.
Well, let me read you another section of the report on the liquidation of the Ministry of Information, since you've mentioned him. This is section 4. It says, these sections, which, for the most part, constitute a regrouping of the old national sections of the Ministry of Information, were largely cut down as compared with the former establishment, and many heavy items of expenditure, such as the publications and subsidizing of newspapers, were abolished. 2 branches, those dealing with Italy and the Central Powers, were taken over from Lord Northcliffe's organization at Crewe House. An officer has been appointed under the American section to deal with the entertainment of visitors from abroad. So there you have it. They're admitting they targeted American soldiers and American politicians.
Yes, and
the whole time.
And their social groups, the Fabians, the Pilgrims, invited the very top elite from our best colleges, our best universities. Names were given through the Inquiry, through Woodrow Wilson's group, through the council, and then these people were courted in Britain, and they were turned into Anglophiles. They were turned into people who were part of the Anglo-American Axis, or the Anglo-American Association, many names for this association, and many different groups they were part of. But what they did was they tried to turn American politicians into good British citizens, because from the beginning, Cecil Rhodes, his number one desire was to bring America back into the British Commonwealth. And we need to remember that that was the drive of their propagandizing of America, is to make us part of Britain. Folks, Britain is as crooked as they can possibly be. They don't have the same rules. They don't have a constitution like we do. The Queen has her own banker. The head of the Bank of England is on the Privy Council. The head of the Queen's Court is on the Privy Council. There's no rules over there. That is, the monarchy gets the out of jail free card.
I think you've pointed that out a number of times, and I think really the key here is that the Americans that were complicit with these people realized that the members of the British Privy Council had a leg up on corruption and insider trading. And so what we have done the entire time is deferred to the Brits, allowed them to really run things while making it appear that American institutions are running things. And that seems to be the what we have today.
And your example of Marconi that you gave last time, so perfect. Marconi, an Italian, somehow gets the stolen patents of Tesla, goes to England and becomes the Lord of Wireless, which then drives the war, and then the cutting of the cable to Germany between Britain through the North Atlantic, and the Brits cut the cable. Then Germany was isolated. Basically, they were going to kill the country of Germany. And then what do? They demonize them through propaganda and say Kaiser Wilhelm has babies on bayonets, that he eats babies, he rips their arms off and drinks their blood. On and on and on, and people believe this because why? This is a new technology. New technology hypnotizes you. It takes away your willpower, and that's what it did.
Here's another irony of you mentioned Italy with Marconi. Now that I'm thinking about it, one of our early discoveries in the Internet of Things, unpacking that, is that a large effort occurred in Italy in the early 2000s through a company called Eurotech Limited, and that company was focused on building embedded systems, and IBM was involved, Cisco was involved, Oracle, all the usual suspects. And what that did is that built backdoors into all of the embedded systems that were deployed all around the planet. So isn't it ironic that that was done in Italy as well? So here we have, you're saying that Marconi was probably the first modern day cardboard cutout.
Absolutely. Not only that, but you can see that, okay, he gets started in Britain, and the Brits have the patent, which they stole from Americans. They slide it into Canada, and they create a huge Canadian company. Then they slide that into America, and they call it the Radio Corporation of America. It's not. It is a British company, and then they control the market here with a monopoly that is astounding, and then GE gets in on it, and then GE becomes the mother company, and nobody can understand where GE comes from, and then it turns into Serco, and Serco then has many, many contracts, as you were about ready to give us a true quote, I would say dozens of contracts, that are the biggest intelligence technology contracts. At the moment the technology becomes available, the Brits get the contract, no bid. They just get the contract. That's the way the Crown agents work in America, whether it be Serco, Crown agents, OPIC, USAID, it doesn't matter. It goes back to the British Privy Council, whether people like it or not.
Yeah, the Crown agents were the major driver for putting in the wireless installations all over the planet back in 1913-14 timeframe. But let's just put this in a little context here, because we're talking about the end of the war in 1920. My mother, my late mother, was born in 1925. So we're talking about, 80 years, 85 years, 88 years? We're not talking about that long ago. So everything we're talking about is within the lifetimes of people we know. And that's what's remarkable about this, is these people have been at this a long time, and they have experimented with different things. But one of the elements of their activity that has been consistent is they have taken over the communications mechanisms, and they have taken over the propaganda mechanisms. And clearly those two are their most successful elements. And then they use that to drive markets up and down and make money for themselves, which then also funds their continuing activity. And it's all based on us allowing our governments to lie to us, because our governments are then there not to regulate these bad activity, but they're in on it.
Oh, and as a matter of fact, lying is part of the commercial deal. If you sign the contract, you are being subliminally controlled. I mean, that's just the way that it is. And everything has a contract, and you don't read it, and you just say, I agree. That would be your phone, your computer, everything. Every technology device you touch is filled with the very control mechanisms, the propaganda devices. And we've shown this to you in our investigative reports. We've shown you in our intelligence reports exactly the patterns, exactly when DARPA started using them, when they called for them to exist, and what they're calling for now to be built. And it is immoral. And that we allow the Department of Defense to drive our technology is immoral. And anyone who sits in Washington, D.C. and allows that doesn't understand that what Trump is doing is we need a Department of Peace soon, not a Department of War. Because the Department of War is created for the people who steal patents and weaponize them. And it's just disgusting to watch this happen with intelligence. But folks, when you're looking at the TV or you're watching a movie, you are basically becoming a willing sheeple of the Tavistock Institute. Facebook is Tavistock. Hollywood is Tavistock. The mainstream media is basically the British War Department, and it's barely been changed since. They even recently ran some memes that look like they're memes back from World War I. They haven't changed a thing. Their attempt is to go into chaotic Marxism, when then the rich can come in and act as attack warlords, bankers and brokers against the common people.
Well, let me give you just an example. Last night at the Y, CNN or MSNBC was on, and their subtitle showing Trump speaking at a cabinet meeting was, "Trump holds a rambling cabinet meeting." So rambling was up there for, I would say, a good 5 minutes or more.
Well,
rambling.
ISIS management, Avid.
Those are the kinds of memes that we're talking about.
Oh yes, and you've pointed it out. I believe it was you who came across the Avid and ISIS management proof that the mainstream media prompters are all giving the same words, and the running text below is part of the U.S. Digital Service, which was created by Eric Schmidt and donated to the mainstream media, so that only the 127 recognized news agencies will have to have the same words that all go through a computer system that makes sure that the words are the same that are being used everywhere. So the word rambling, had you noticed and quickly changed to other channels, would have been at the crawl at the bottom of every news agency, because that's the way it works.
Right.
That's mainstream media. That is paperclip. That is propaganda, the War Office, turned into television. Hollywood are the films, and what we have as what we consider media comes down to 6 major corporations, and those corporations are owned by, that's right, the same usual suspects who serve the court, who serve the bankers, and who are also, unfortunately, the brokers.
I'm fascinated by this War Cabinet secret document 2941 on December 11th, 1917, a psychological offensive to be launched at a well-selected psychological moment. This is the government of Britain planning a psychological moment that will not only attack the enemy, but will also attack neutral parties and their own people. So I just can't see how much more clear we can be about the agenda of these people. And when you start looking at their resumes, which our people are also doing, these are some of the most inhuman, cruel people, extremely egotistical, and have a dozen initials after their name. They were obviously well treated by this insider group, and yet everyone else is left to pick up the pieces. And that's what's so offensive about this to me as an American and as a citizen of this country, and also somebody who used to live in England, has a lot of friends there. We have been lied to 24/7 by 365 our whole lives by governments who allowed themselves the privilege of lying to us and making money on it. This we have to stop. We can't allow this. It's been going on at least 100 years, and you're saying longer than that, but in contemporary terms with the development of wireless for 100 years, and they're using technology as their weapon of choice. We have to stop this, and we have to stop this now. And I'm hoping that the policymakers in President Trump's cabinet who get a hold of this information will help in developing a plan to dismantle this 100-year war against humanity.
That's right, Michael. Absolutely. We have to underscore that. It's about morality. And as we have pointed out again and again recently, war is the misuse of patents. It's the misuse of technology. It's the misuse of the genius of humanity and used for war. And war first, and war always, and war to make money. And that's the disgusting part of this. It simply has to end. We have to go back and ask questions about morality. And when you create a new device, whether it's a machine of any type, going back to World War I, every new device that was created that was turned to war moved us towards killing each other. And no one seems to be asking the principal questions. Just because it's capitalistically gainful for the bankers and the brokers does not mean that that is moral, and we should stop using technology for immorality, because at the moment that we use technology immorally, we become the slaves of that technology. And we see that with what happens with our children, with telephones, with computers, with Facebook, with social media. If you can't see the addiction, and if you don't understand the illness, and you don't get the fact that we're turning our own children into slaves of machines, then you don't know where the war is going on. This is a cyber war. This is an information war. This is a counterintelligence war. That's the reason we're out there telling you the truth, because falsehood is stuck in your face. And if you don't have discernment, then unfortunately you become a slave to the machine instead of turning it around and now unweaponizing and turning what we do in citizen intelligence into counterintelligence. And we war against those warring against us with their own machines. But we don't let those machines control us. We understand what they are. And that's what would have happened had Leader Technology been the moral company that brought scalability to social media, which is really what happened. But we got to see that it was instantaneously weaponized and taken by the capitalists, the bankers, and the brokers, and that the evil still goes on and perpetrates to this very moment in the courts and in the fight. And so, President, sign the Miller Act, because when you do, we're going to see the accelerated fall, which we have predicted. We were the first ones to predict that. The fall of FANG is happening before your eyes. If you don't see it, you just need to clean out your ears, open your eyes, and stop watching mainstream media, because mainstream media turns you into its slave of Tavistock chaos Marxism. And if you don't get that, then you don't get propaganda. Now, Obama made propaganda legal. Trump has made it illegal. And so that entire agency is now called the United States Agency for Global Media. No longer the Broadcasting Board of Governors. He put an end to it. Propagandizing Americans is no longer legal. Let's end it everywhere, not only in America, but in the world.